This is a fascinating passage of scripture that I want us to take some time looking at, just a few minutes. And we're going to go through it verse by verse. In verse 1, it starts with on the third day. Now that's an odd way to start. The reason why it's a little bit odd is because when we come to our Bible, we're starting today in chapter 2. But 2 follows after. What does 2 follow after? 1. So there's a whole chapter that's happened before this. And earlier in the first chapter of John, Jesus had been calling his disciples at the end of chapter 1. He's calling disciples to follow him, Philip, Nathanael. And on the third day after calling them to follow him, to commit their lives to being his disciples, the third day, a wedding took place. Now, weddings in ancient Israel were a little bit different than weddings today. Today, we go and celebrate a wedding and we have a great time, and it may last a couple of hours. And then we go to the wedding will last about an hour, and then we go to the party afterwards, and maybe 3 or 4 hours later, we go back home. In the first century, there are some wedding feasts and celebrations that would last a whole week long. They would really celebrate a wedding. And there was a joyous moment. And even at times, a wedding became a symbol for the time when God would restore the kingdom, and it would be a joyous celebration of what we call the Messianic era or the Messianic kingdom. It was a symbol of celebration, so they would celebrate it well. Now, at this wedding, Jesus's mother was there, so Mary was there, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the wedding. There's a strong possibility that this is somebody that might have been a distant relative, a cousin of Jesus, or at least a close friend of Jesus. So Jesus and his disciples and his family are there. Later we find out that his brothers are there too. Now, there's a problem that happens. So the story sets off into motion that they're at this wedding. But then there's a complication. Sometimes you guys learn, the older 5th, 6th grade students, 4th grade students, you guys learn about plot structure. Plot structure has a problem or a complication that's introduced into the story. Well, here's a complication of the story. When the wine was gone, that's a problem. When we go to weddings today, we have a lot of options of what to drink. We could have water, we could have soda, we could have tea. In the ancient Israel, they really didn't have a lot of options for drinking. Most people either drank water or wine. So here in the first century, there's a challenge because in ancient Israel, here's the problem. In ancient Israel, this would be a social disaster. The bride and the groom were responsible for having enough there for the feast. So when they run out, not only is it a social disaster, but it's really, it's not just embarrassing, but it's wrong socially for them. We've made a big problem. It's like having a birthday party and you're going to say, hey, we're going to have pizza. I'm going to have all 30 of my classmates come out. We're going to have pizza and we're going to have soda. We're going to have Coke Zero. We're going to have all these things. And you show up and there's one small pizza for all 30 of your friends to eat. That would be a problem. Well, that's what happens in this wedding. The wine runs out. And the bride and the groom, especially the groom, is at risk of really being embarrassed, and more than that, doing something that was socially wrong. So Jesus' mother said to Jesus, they have no more wine. Jesus' reply is a little bit interesting. He says, dear woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my time has not yet come. It's a respectful way. It's almost like Jesus is saying, ma'am, why are you involving me in this? This is his mother, but what Jesus is doing is drawing a little bit of a distance here because this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And what he's going to do with his mom, he's going to, in a very respectful way, he's going to let her know, listen, my time to reveal myself as the Messiah has not yet come. and to start fulfilling all of the miracles that I'm going to be doing has not yet come in full. So it's not for you, my mom, as much as I love you, it's not for you to determine when I start doing these miracles. Now remind yourselves, what did Mary see? Mary saw all the miracles involving Jesus' birth. She knew that he was a special child. So she was ready for Jesus to start. She was ready for Jesus to proclaim who he really is. And Jesus said, ma'am, it's not your choice. You don't get to choose when this happens. This happens in the Father's time. But yet his mother still said in verse 5, his mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. She knew enough that Jesus could do whatever he wants. So whatever Jesus tells you to do, you do it. That's good advice, right? It's good advice for us. Whatever Jesus tells you to do, you do it. It's great advice. So verse 6, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. The Jewish culture and community, you can see this is archaeology has unpacked. This is a picture from stone jars that are in a museum in Israel. So this is from the 1st century. These were stone jars. They weren't pottery. They were jars that were carved out of stone. And this would have been about the size that you would have seen Jesus talking about here in John. There were 6 of them, and they were used for ceremonial washing. So after the wedding feast was over, the Jewish people that were present had to wash their hands to be clean. So this would have been the jars that they would have used to fill with water for them to wash their hands. Now, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Now, I wanted to give you a visual picture of how much that is. 6 of them, each holding 20 gallons. Those of you that have learned multiplication, 6 times 20 is 120. Now, 120 would be the minimum amount of water in these 6 stone jars. It could go up to 30. 6 times 30 is 180 gallons. So, here is a gallon of water. We're talking about 120 to 180 of these gallons of water. That's going to be filling these jars. All right? It's a lot of water. We could all drink really well with 120. There's plenty. 120 gallons or 180 gallons would be more than enough for all of us for a long period of time. So what happens? Verse 7, Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. They filled them to the top. All of these jars were filled with water. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the ceremony. Like we have today in weddings, there's often a master of the ceremony, somebody who's announcing the, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Mr. and Mrs. whoever, Smith. The first time ever you get to welcome them as a married couple. Well, this was a master of ceremonies who was guiding people through the wedding banquet. So they did so. And in verse 9, the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. So this is interesting. Jesus is going to do a miracle here, but it's not a completely public miracle. There's only going to be a few people that kind of see it. It's going to be Mary, it's going to be the disciples, and it's going to be these servants. They kind of see what happens. The rest of the wedding party has no idea. Even the groom doesn't know what's happening, right? So then he called the bridegroom aside. The master of the ceremony calls the bridegroom aside, and he said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. So in other words, what he's saying is, look, what you just gave me to taste is of a better quality than what we were drinking before in celebration. This is even better. You saved the best. You could have, in fact, let's do this. No longer is it water, now it's orange juice. We'll say orange juice, right? So there are different qualities of orange juice. There are some orange juices that we say are from concentrate. There are some orange juices that back in my time, when I was growing up, my mom would buy this frozen little plug, a cube of orange juice. We would put the frozen cube of orange juice into a jar. Then we would pour water into it and stir it up and stir it up and stir it up until that which is frozen became part of the juice. That was the cheap orange juice. The better orange juice is when you take the oranges and you spin them, and you get fresh orange juice with pulp, and it tastes great. If you've ever been to Cheesecake Factory on a Sunday for brunch or Saturday, that's great orange juice, right? So, what the master of the ceremony says, in most weddings, you might bring out the best juice, the hand-squeezed juice first. And then after everybody's had enough, then you bring out the cheap juice. But he says that's not what you've done. This wine is better than the first wine you sent us. This is the good stuff. So what is he saying? That Jesus just took this, all 120 to 180 gallons that used to be water, and turned them into wine. Can anybody here do that? No. Can I do that? No. Can Officer Lewis do that? No. Nobody can do that. There's only one person that can do that. God. And Jesus does that here. He takes it and he makes it the best stuff. It's not just so-so wine, it's the good wine. And then we see this in verse 11. This is the first of his miraculous signs Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. Now, let me share with you. This sign, this is the first miracle Jesus does. This is the first sign. And what we see in John's gospel from this chapter, chapter 2, all the way through chapter 11, there are going to be 7 of these signs. And all of these signs demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the one that Israel has been longing for and waiting for. And what we're going to do this year is we're going to look at these 7 signs. And we're going to also look at these other passages in John, they call the I am passages. And we're going to look at these and we're going to see all of these truths about who Jesus is. In this case, he has power over creation. He can take water and turn it into something that's not water anymore. He is the sovereign one who also cares for his people. He didn't want the groom to be embarrassed. He didn't want the groom to have this social wrongdoing. And he helps him out in the midst of his trial. And as a result, he reveals his glory. And then there's this key part, and the disciples put their faith in him. Now, remember what happened in chapter 1? Jesus called his disciples to follow him. And when they see, they like his teaching, they're attracted to his teaching. And now they just seen a miracle that he does. And they said, we're following the right one. And students, I want to tell you today that the same Jesus who turned the water into wine is still the right one. Now, the disciples had the privilege of being there and seeing it, live and in person. We don't have that same privilege, but what we have is a reliable witness. We have the scriptures that show the miracles of Jesus. And we get to see all of the things that Jesus did. And when we see throughout this year the miracles that Jesus did, we have one response: believe in him. Believe in Jesus. And part of believing is obedience and walking with him, becoming his disciples. While Jesus was walking, there were 12 disciples, but now we can have a whole grammar school of disciples. And that's our calling this year, to grow as disciples of Christ, to grow as people that are following the one that can take a simple 120 to 180 gallons of water and turn them into a fantastic 120 to 180 gallons of wine. Students, we serve a great God. We have a great Messiah, and ultimately this Messiah is going to care for us to the point where he goes to the cross. And we will see that later this year. All right? So as you go back to your classes today, think about who the God is that you serve. Think about the majesty of Jesus and follow him more closely. Let's pray.